We got the last of the Epstein orders in just yesterday from Judge Richard Berman in the Southern District of New York. And I'm going to skip to the last page of his 14-page decision and order that I have right here, because this is the essential part of it. Quote, the information contained in the Epstein grand jury transcripts pales in comparison to the Epstein investigation information and materials in the hands of the Department of Justice. I mean, that's it, folks. It's what we've been saying here. What we've been talking about for, months now? Since July? The reality is, convicted felon Donald Trump, who we know his name appears several times in the Epstein Files. Convicted felon Donald Trump holds the keys to the transparency for the American people concerning the Epstein Files. Period. End of story. In fact, I could just hit stop on this recording, couldn't I? It's not Attorney General Pamela Jo Bondi. She's only doing what felon Trump tells her to do. It's Donald Trump, who is the person who could stand to gain the most if he just let the files out. I mean, if according to you, Donald Trump, there's nothing to see here, that you don't have anything wrong, that in fact, these files exculpate you, as your former Attorney General Bill Barr suggests, and we're going to get to that in just a second, then why not? What are you hiding? What is the cover up surrounding these Epstein files? It is insane to me that somebody like Pamela Jo Bondi, who is a licensed attorney in Florida and is the chief top law enforcement officer in the United States, that she hasn't sat down and explained to her client, because let's be clear here. She may be the Attorney General of the United States, but the reality is she's only serving one client, and that's Donald Trump. Same as Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche and others. But it's astounding to me that Pamela Jo hasn't sat down Donald Trump and read him for filth and said, look, you look dumb. You look dumb that you're not letting these Epstein files out. We can carefully and thoughtfully redact the victims and the survivors' names, but you look like you're hiding something, because you know what? Sometimes when it walks like a duck, sounds like a duck, smells like a duck, you know what it is? It's cover-up. And it's a Donald Trump specialty. Cover up is a Donald Trump specialty. But let's get into this order, because we get so much knowledge, and knowledge is power when we read. So this was filed August 20th in the Southern District of New York, and in yet another incredibly thoughtful order from a federal judge concerning these sensitive Epstein files and Maxwell files. So on the first page, the judge walks through what he has reviewed, and he's reviewed the relevant findings, but I wanted to make sure y'all caught this. Judge Berman also reviewed the grand jury transcripts. Now footnote here, an important one. This is dealing with the Epstein grand jury transcripts. The order that was in Florida was Epstein related, but it was small, and it was immediately entered denying the request to unseal the transcripts down there, because there really was nothing there. The biggie was just a few weeks ago, and that was concerning the Ghislaine Maxwell grand jury transcripts. And that was a scathing smackdown of the Trump administration. You will recall that judge called out the Trump administration for its artifice, for its trickery, for its attempts to deceive and mislead the American public in suggesting that there would be something monumental and huge contained within those grand jury transcripts. And now we have Judge Berman, the judge who has the Jeffrey Epstein file issue, right? The case, the criminal case in the Southern District of New York. That judge has entered this particular order. So again, let's dive into the details, because the devil is certainly going to be in the details. Judge Berman notes the grand jury transcripts dated June 18th, 2019 and July 2nd, 2019 together total only 70 pages. That's it, folks. The grand jury exhibits, which is a PowerPoint presentation and 4 pages of call logs. There were 2 letters from attorneys for the Epstein victims and from individual victims for a total of 4 letters. A letter from the Epstein estate executors dated August 5th, 2025, and the opinion and the order dated August 11th from the Maxwell case denying the motion to unseal. And based upon this judge's review of all of that, this court denies the government's motion to unseal the Epstein grand jury transcripts and exhibits. Judge Berman reminds the reader that in June of 2008, Jeffrey Epstein pled guilty in Florida state court, not federal court, to one count of procuring a person under the age of 18 for prostitution, a felony, and one count of solicitation of prostitution, also a felony. Epstein was sentenced to 18 months in prison, although he only served 13 months in a work release program. This is that sweetheart plea deal I talk about all the time, the one that happened in the mid-2000s here in Florida. The one that former United States Attorney for the Southern District of Florida, Alex Acosta, his fingerprints and DNA are all over that sweetheart plea deal. And Judge Berman notes here that there's a non-prosecution agreement that was entered by and between Epstein and the Southern District of Florida based upon Epstein's abuse of minor girls. I've mentioned this also several times. Why has Alex Acosta not received a subpoena to testify before the House Oversight Committee? Who the hell needs to hear from Bill Barr? I don't need to hear from Bill Barr. I don't need to hear from Hillary Clinton. You know who I need to hear from? Alex Acosta. And yet, mysteriously, that guy doesn't get a subpoena. And he would be the one who would have the most relevant information concerning what happened with that sweetheart plea deal at a minimum, right? So the order goes on, and it makes sure that it's clear that Judge Berman recognizes that the victim and the survivors of Epstein and Maxwell are the most important people. He notes that at the August 27, 2019 hearing after Epstein was dead, the court heard from no less than 23 Epstein victims about the dismissal of that prosecution, because obviously if Epstein's dead, the prosecution will not move any farther. So Judge Berman walks through the legal standard, but let's skip ahead and let's really focus on the important kind of meat on the bone here, which is this. This is page 6, and this is an exact quote from Judge Berman. A significant and compelling reason to reject the government's position in this litigation is that the government has already undertaken a comprehensive investigation into the Epstein case and, not surprisingly, has assembled a, quote, trove of Epstein documents, interviews, and exhibits. Trove is actually the word that Pam Bondi and the DOJ used concerning the Epstein files. Judge Berman goes on. The government committed that it would share its Epstein investigation materials with the public. And he cites to the press release of Pamela Jo Bondi back in February of 2025. Quote, the department remains committed to transparency and intends to release the remaining Epstein documents, end quote. Judge Berman then notes that the government's 100,000 pages of Epstein files and materials dwarf the 70-odd pages of Epstein grand jury materials. The government's Epstein files are sui generis. They are investigatory and not subject to Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure 6 sub E. 6 sub E is the one that basically says grand jury materials remain secret and confidential except for special circumstances and exceptions, none of which are met here, by the way, either in Maxwell's case or in Epstein's case. But Judge Berman makes sure that we understand in his order that the government's Epstein files, they're not subject to any of this confidentiality. They're not subject to any of this grand jury secrecy rules. Again, if he could, he should. He being Donald Trump. And he can, so he should. In fact, he must, but he doesn't. The government is the logical party to make comprehensive disclosure to the public of the Epstein files. By comparison, the instant grand jury motion appears to be a, quote, diversion from the breadth and scope of the Epstein files in the government's possession. The grand jury testimony is merely a hearsay snippet of Jeffrey Epstein's alleged conduct. In February of 2025, the government, as noted, was prepared to release their Epstein files to the public. But then, on July 6, 2025, the government announced it would not make the files available to the public. Why? Maybe because there's stuff in there that Donald Trump doesn't want us to see. Judge Berman then very logically notes that there's another compelling reason not to unseal the Epstein grand jury materials, and that's namely possible threats to victims' safety and privacy. He says that the government failed to give the victims sufficient notice prior to even filing the motions to unseal. And so there is a legitimate fear and concern on the part of the Epstein victims and survivors that, you know what, maybe their safety and their privacy will be wholesale violated if these grand jury materials are turned over. And yet, you know what? That should be the primary concern. And yet I don't know how hard it is for this government, because we know that they've put all of these FBI agents to scour the Epstein files to look for Donald Trump's names, as reported by Allison Gill, right? We know that they were trained at the FBI to be able to look for Donald Trump's name, according to Allison, right? I mean, how hard would it be to be able to comply with the government's, or excuse me, the court's rules about redacting people's, confidential and private information? Shouldn't be that damn hard. And yet, you know what? It hasn't even been done. Interestingly, the co-executors of Jeffrey Epstein's estate take no position regarding the government's motion to unseal. I mean, the guy is dead. So the executors of the estate are like, whatever. It comes out, it comes out. I mean, clearly they don't take a position on what it is. The government says that there's a public interest in disclosing it, but that in and of itself, according to Judge Berman, is not sufficient to overcome the standard that grand jury proceedings and documents remain confidential. Judge Berman notes, and this is an important thing for y'all to know as well, on page 10, not a single victim was called to testify before the Epstein grand jury. In fact, the only witness in the grand jury was a law enforcement FBI agent who had no direct knowledge of the facts of the case and whose testimony was mostly hearsay. The grand jury materials specifically are the following: a 56-page transcript of that FBI agent's presentation to the grand jury on June 18th, 2019, a 14-page transcript of that agent's presentation to the grand jury on July 2nd of 2019, a PowerPoint exhibit that was shown on June 18th, and a call log exhibit that was shown on July 2nd. That's it. That's it. Nothing more. So the more than 3 gigabytes of data, that, quote, trove of information that the DOJ claims in its press release in July that it has investigated and reviewed, which, by the way, they have used as the justification for not prosecuting anybody else and not actually chasing down any leads anymore. Where's that information? Because that sure as hell is more than what Judge Berman has noted here. Judge Berman goes on page 11 to make sure that we understand the following. The material, the desired material that the DOJ wants to have unsealed is a, quote, relatively modest amount, 70 pages plus exhibits, of Epstein grand jury information, which is secret under that criminal rule of procedure 6E. The material was sufficient to obtain the indictment of Jeffrey Epstein, but no more, not more. Because Epstein died before trial, the material was never presented to a trial jury. It was never subjected to cross-examination or examination. It's the hearsay testimony of just one FBI agent. The government has estimated that some of that Epstein grand jury information has already become public via the Maxwell criminal trial. Because the Epstein case never went to trial, most of the Epstein grand jury material did not become public. However, and again, here's the important point. Judge Berman wants us, and really wants the Trump administration to know that he knows. The desired material refers also to the government's substantial investigative trove concerning the Epstein case and presumably the Maxwell case as well. The government has so far withheld these materials from the public. Very recently, the government announced that it was going to make these materials public, presumably piecemeal, in response to a congressional subpoena. End quote. What's he talking about? Remember, August 19th, that's 2 days ago. That was the deadline by which the DOJ was supposed to comply with the House oversight subpoena that was served, bipartisan, by the way, with James Comer's signature on that subpoena. And yet, we haven't seen anything. We also know Bill Barr has testified behind closed doors. Why isn't that made public? And what we do know critically is Robert Garcia, Congressman Garcia, has advised that whatever Bill Barr and Comer has represented to the public in terms of Barr's testimony is not accurate, is not complete. I don't need Bill Barr's filter on not only his testimony, but on what the Epstein files are. I don't need Bill Barr kissing Donald Trump's ass and suggesting that Trump doesn't have any type of involvement in the Epstein case. Get out of here. What type of continuing insult is that to the American public to suggest that we're not capable, intelligent, and rational enough to be able to discern and use our own critical thinking skills to be able to discern people's involvement with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell? You know, MAGA, if you're listening, and I know you are because you like to hate watch, love ya. Here's the thing. It's a slap in the face for you. Donald Trump wants you to think that he's not involved in any of this. But gosh, Wouldn't you want to be able to decide for yourself if he is or not? Why not just turn it all over? Redacted, of course, to protect the victims and the survivors, but why not just turn it all over? Maybe because where there's smoke, there's fire. Judge Berman says the government's complete information trove would better inform the public about the Epstein case. 100%. The victims were not called to testify in the Epstein grand jury. They did speak at that August 27th, 2019 hearing, but that was it. According to the government, there's over 1,000 victims of Jeffrey Epstein. Judge Berman says it's difficult to know how many victims favor unsealing, how many favor continued sealing, but it's likely that those who do favor disclosure assume that their safety, privacy, and dignity will be protected. And he concludes with what we started with. The information contained in the Epstein grand jury transcripts pales in comparison to the Epstein investigation information and materials in the hands of the Department of Justice. So he's denied it. You know, I saw on social media the other day some dumbass MAGA say, oh, look at that Democrat judge that didn't unseal in the Maxwell case. You know they're going to say the same thing about Judge Berman in this order. How about we use our brains? Okay, MAGA? If you've got federal judges that have now repeatedly told you, it's like 70 pages. It's like 90 pages. Yeah, I guess, you know what? Maybe, maybe not, but the law requires that it stays sealed and nothing from the government. The government hasn't met its burden to be able to merit unsealing it. But hey, the government has even more. Are you satisfied, MAGA, with only 70 pages in the Epstein case? Let's not even talk about the Ghislaine Maxwell stuff. Are you satisfied with 70 pages? Would that make you happy? You and I both know the answer is no. Donald Trump is hiding stuff from you. That is reality. He's hiding stuff. Why not give it to the American people? Why this drip, drip, drip through all of these very curated sources? Why not just give it to the American people? Create a website, hyperlink. Here are the documents. Redacted appropriately so. You know, that congressional subpoena, the DOJ in that subpoena is required to turn over the entirety of the Epstein Files. The entirety of the Epstein Files, people, not just a little bit. And the depositions continue. But this order was not a big surprise. The only wrinkle was, how is Judge Berman going to deal with the fact that Epstein's dead? Because in the Maxwell case, Maxwell's still alive. Her appeal, you know, she's petitioned the Supreme Court to take up her appeal. I mean, there were other reasons in the Maxwell case why the motion to unseal was going to be denied. But in this instance, vis-a-vis Epstein, I was wondering whether or not that was going to be a factor. And look, again, another thoughtful, well-reasoned decision and order coming from a federal judge in an incredibly sensitive matter. We can't let our foot off the gas, people. We can focus on a million things, illegal gerrymandering in Texas, you know, bumping up and bolstering the California redistricting plan from Governor Newsom, the tariffs, I mean, the unlawful federalizing of DC. I mean, we could do it all, people, right? But what we cannot take our foot off the gas pedal involving Epstein. There has to be accountability. For whom? You want to have the people that are involved, name them and shame them, make sure that we know who they are. But who deserves the accountability? Like, who deserves to have people held accountable for it? It's the victims and the survivors. They deserve it. Be mad, be outraged, demand accountability like we are. I'm grateful for you. I'm grateful that you are paying attention to this and that you're focusing on this and that you're also making sure that we continue to do so, especially, by the way, in independent media. Mainstream mentions it here or there, but they're not giving it the attention that it deserves. Why? Because they're just like dog, squirrel, ball. And I love dogs. You know that. Alrighty, I'll see you on the other side. Katie Phang here. We launched the Katie Phang News Channel in partnership with the Midas Touch Network so we could bring you the latest in legal and political news. Straight, no chaser. So if you're a fellow truth teller, hit that subscribe button and share the word about this channel so we can build a high information America together.